So today I'm joined by Michael Ginsberg. He is working on his doctorate in engineering science at the Columbia University, and he's also the author of Harness It, Renewable Energy Technologies and Project Development Models, Transforming the Grid, as well as his other book, Solar Photovoltaic Power Optimization, Enhancing System Performance Through Operations and Measurement. Michael, welcome.
Thank you.
So my first question is, broadly, can you share what is variable renewable energy and what are some challenges with integrating VRE into the energy grid?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me here. When we talk about variable renewable energy, we're primarily thinking about wind and solar energy. You often will hear the term intermittency. Well, this is something that happens because of the fact that we don't have constant wind and solar, the constant wind and solar resource. So during the day, you'll have fluctuating wind and solar. And so looking at it from the perspective of the utility, they say that it varies. And so we say it's variable. And this causes some issues for ensuring consistent power.
Right. And what are some of the challenges in terms of incorporating renewables into the traditional grid system?
Yeah, so I like to say that energy is really one of the only commodities that can't be stored. You think about grain, for instance, and that's something that you can keep for a while. But when you think about energy, it's really a very difficult thing to store and transport. We have batteries, and those are still pretty high in cost, but most people don't quite grasp that we actually have, we use what's called pumped hydropower to store energy, and that's been around for quite some time. But we're running out of that resource. We've used a lot of the natural water ways that are available to us, and so we have to explore different options. So one of those is through batteries, and we're running up against some technological limits there, although there's a lot of interesting research and development going on. But we also have to look at other sort of destinations for the solar and wind that's coming onto the grid, and how do we store and transport that? And so in my research, I look at how to provide extra value from the excess solar that we're getting.
Okay, let's talk about some of the trends that's happening in the solar side. So aside from the large scale solar PV that we've been seeing for some time, we're starting to see a rise in distributed energy such as microgrids and community solar. What does this mean for the future of the grid, energy grid, as well as its flexibility?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, and I think that what's happening now is we're seeing a transformation in the way in which our energy is generated as well as distributed. So if you look back in the early 20th century, electricity was developed and it was designed to be far from where our consumption is taking place. But today we're starting to see rooftop solar really taking off, and increasingly we're seeing what's called microgrids and community solar. And so that's an aggregation of solar energy and wind energy as well as other sources. I think that's representing a big change because it's redefining the relationship that we have between the utility and ourselves as consumers. We say that we're now prosumers because we're also providing electricity to the grid. One example of where that's taking place in a particularly heated fashion is in San Diego, where you have the city of San Diego actually redefining what the utility, San Diego Gas and Electric Company, is responsible for. So they want to select the type of energy that they're using, and so no longer is the utility responsible for providing the power. They're only responsible for maintenance of transmission and distribution lines. And that's a model called community choice aggregation. So we're starting to see this at a much larger scale. And in my opinion, in the future, in the next 10, 20 years, we're going to have a much different relationship with the utility.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So let's take the example of some of the recent hurricanes, like, for example, hitting the Caribbeans and Puerto Rico, for instance. Part of the issue was that they were really relying on one or two power sources. So when a storm hits, everything goes down on the islands. The ability for distributed energy sources means that you can have the ability to come back online much quicker, unlike some of the issues that we were seeing last year, for example. It's very interesting in terms of the relationship. Does the relationship then change not only the buyer-seller relationship, but also the market dynamics and the pricing?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say there's a few different types of systems that we can have when it comes to a microgrid. The first level is providing energy assurance, where you could have 30% of your load covered. So that's sort of supplementing the existing utility. Then you go to energy independence, where you're designing the system to cover 100% of your loads for that facility or for that community. The next dynamic is where you're actually net generating energy, and then you're becoming a producer to the electric grid. So what you're seeing is, in the United States primarily, and in Europe, we have these schemes called net metering, which I'm sure you're familiar with, but the utility is pushing back against those as more and more distributed generation comes online. I took an excellent course with the Director of Distributed Energy Resources at Con Edison in the city of New York. And from the perspective of the utility, solar and wind, as we talked about with variability, proposes some issues to the utility. So in a net metering scheme, you'll have something where your meter will just roll back for any power that you're sending out. So you're basically paid as at the same exact retail rate that you would be paying. That's not quite fair, because those generators that are providing power to the utility are actually at a wholesale rate, which is often half what the actual cost of the retail rate would be. So that's really undermining the utility's bottom line. And in addition, there's some infrastructure upgrades that are required to accommodate the type of power coming from solar and wind, and the fact that it's coming from typical loads or destinations that are considered consuming. So for instance, when you're sending power out to the grid, it's going kind of in the reverse direction historically, and so it needs to go through a transformer. That transformer is designed to trip if it senses something going in the wrong direction. So it's incumbent on the utility to actually make sure that it can accommodate that. Now, that's a technological issue that has been worked out, but it definitely represents a cost. So in my work, I endeavor to be fair and comprehensively consider the costs as well as the value. So in a nutshell, we're moving away from this idea of net metering to what's called value of solar. And a lot of counties and states around the U.S. And in Europe are looking at how what is the actual comprehensive value of solar, including the costs to the utility, as well as the value that you get from reducing the use of carbon, and other environmental issues.
Yeah, I think that's a necessary methodology shift, because to your point, there are very much explicit and implicit costs, infrastructure costs, and maintenance costs on the part of the utilities. So using that metering is very much handicapping them. Whereas this new method that you're talking about really looks at it from a holistic perspective, takes into account the positive as well as the negative externalities and the net effect of solar in particular. Let's transition to talk about decarbonization. What does it mean of PV plus X, and how does it actually achieve deep decarbonization of total energy?
Yeah, I'm really excited that we're starting to talk about this. So we primarily looked at the electric grid as the main emitter of greenhouse gases, but there's a lot of other sectors of our economy that need to be decarbonized. So you look at the transportation sector, you look at the agricultural sector. There's a ton of other parts of our energy economy that are actually producing and leading to greenhouse gas emissions, as well as other harmful emissions. So we don't need to just reduce the energy, the fossil fuel use that's resulting in electrical power for our electrical grid, we need to also look at these other sectors. And what I'm focused on is what's called PV plus X, which is when solar has become actually very affordable. So when we have extra amounts of solar that we don't know what to do with, because as I mentioned, it can't be easily stored, there are other potential destinations for it, and that is the X. So PV plus the production of hydrogen, and hydrogen can be used in a hydrogen economy, so to speak, for to power fuel cells, to drive other industrial processes that would traditionally get hydrogen from fossil fuel sources. And so in addition to that, there's other chemical processes that could be used from renewable energy. So we need to remove the carbon from basically all sectors of our economy. If we're truly concerned with achieving a reduction in CO2 emissions that's required under the IPCC, in order to do that, we can't just look at the electrical grid.
So tell us about some of the techniques that's possible for PV plus X.
Sure. So at Columbia University, actually, there's some cutting-edge research in looking into a couple of things that I like to talk about. We have what's called PV electrolysis, which is the splitting of a water molecule, H2O, to produce hydrogen. Typically, that was done through fossil fuels, and there's a lot of energy required for that. We traditionally haven't been able to do that through PV because of the high cost. But today that's changing. And in one research team is looking at the ability to do PV electrolysis actually at sea and have this as a passive production of hydrogen, constantly throughout the year. The reason that we couldn't do that before was the membranes that are used for this process are actually degrading, and they would require too much replacement over time for it to make any economic sense. But there's some new developments that Professor Esposito's team has developed, which is called we say membraneless electrolyzer, but really it's a nanomembrane, and it's not susceptible to the same types of environmental degradation. Another really interesting development is what we call dual function material, and that is the ability to capture the CO2 from the flue gas of a power plant, and then through the addition of hydrogen, which we assume will be from solar, to produce methane. So essentially we're creating a closed loop for the production through the use of natural gas without actually having to tap into new resources. So these are two technologies that are coming out that are really very encouraging to see, because they're taking advantage of our existing infrastructure, and they're allowing us to use solar for other sectors of our economy.
Now, what is the receptivity by the industry to adopt some of these new methods and new technologies?
I think that that industry is eager to get their hands on new technologies, and there's some of them that are still currently in the lab, but I think that they would be very much interested in doing so. From a policy perspective, you see industry is often leading the way when it comes to clean technology.
So speaking of R&D and research to commercialization, can you talk about some of the other things that's happening in PV, battery storage, and carbon capture? Yeah,
sure. So if you've visited a solar energy conference lately, I'm sure that the majority of the posters have been about what's called perovskites. And so perovskites are a very exciting new area of research, because they are a part of what we say is the third generation of solar cell. They are both low cost as well as high efficiency. And so they can be synthesized in the lab instead of using a tremendous amount of energy that we need to produce the silicon, which we use in most of solar cells today. And perovskites are currently faced with some issues, notably that they degrade quickly upon exposure to oxygen and humidity. But these are issues that we believe we can resolve. It's only a matter of time. There's also some exciting applications for these perovskite solar cells, including for remote and military use, as well as the fact that we could actually put them in windows, which is something that the Department of Energy has worked on for an actual product, which they're calling switch glaze. And this product would be able to act both as a transparent window as well as an energy producer when light hits it. So it both acts as a glazing to protect your eyes and also serves as a window and produces electricity. So with the added versatility of perovskite cells, I think that solar energy will become ubiquitous in our society. We won't necessarily know that it's on top of a roof. It will be in many different things in our physical infrastructure.
Now, one of the things you point out in your book that you share with me in advance of this conversation is that I think some 60% of the cost of solar installation, and again, this is more around distributed solar energy, solar top commercial real estate, is that most of that cost is not actually this kind of the hard material aspects of it, which you're talking about, but it's the soft cost. It's the engineering, it's the labor, it's the profit margin. Can you talk a little bit about that, also in the context of tariff wars?
Yeah. So the interesting thing is that material costs, as you said, are actually very low, and what we're hitting now is more of an organizational issue in terms of further cost reduction. So we say that soft costs, which are the engineering as well as primarily the permitting of a solar energy system, is the highest. In my experience as a residential solar energy system designer, there's a lot of hoops and hassle you have to go through to get your system up and running. I'll give you an example. In California, there's quite a lot of permitting bodies that you have to go through. So we call those AHJs, authorities having jurisdiction, and there's over 18,000 of those within the United States. So if you want to operate as an installer or a PV designer in any one particular state, you need to have whatever they're requiring. In my book, I talk about what's called the Solar ABCs, which is a great effort that was done by the DOE as well as a guy named Bill Brooks and his team to standardize the permitting process. But the adoption of that has been very slow, and there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to streamline this.
Yeah, that is something that I think probably doesn't get enough media time, and certainly, organizations like EU that are probably more at the forefront than the US when it comes to these policies really needs to come from the top-down approach to unify and to streamline some of those permitting and standards and the different authorities that are involved in issuance of these permits. So it's highly problematic, and you're right. There's a lot of unnecessary hoops that can be absolutely streamlined.
Exactly. I would just say also there's a lingering or on the horizon there is an issue of recycling of spent PV modules. And that's something my advisor, Dr. Vasilis Thanakis, he's been involved in cadmium telluride recycling. He's been involved in this for years. We are very behind, I want to say, the European Union. We need a plan in place for the recapture, recycling, and repurposing of spent PV modules.
Yeah, and that's especially problematic given the fact that China is no longer taking not only plastic waste, but also recycled waste. And of course, a lot of these spent used PV solar panels have dangerous chemicals that needs to be addressed properly. Mm-hmm. So a huge issue that is just surmounting that, again, most mainstream people are just completely unaware of. Any kind of last sagacious either advice or insights or just practical things that the industry and the private sector should be thinking about?
Yeah, I would say one thing that is very exciting is I'm sure many people have heard the buzzword machine learning, but I think machine learning has a role also in grid integration as well as PV operations and maintenance. So what I'm talking about is the ability to predict, the the good frequency of cleaning of arrays to monitor and diagnose inverter issues. That's something I talk a lot about in my book on PV operations and maintenance. Also, machine learning can be used for predicting the future, predicting weather patterns, and for predicting also prices of anything really. So I think there's a role that this new trend of data analysis will play. I guess I would also say that in my research and in general, it's really important to consider environmental impacts in a holistic way. So when we design and install solar energy systems, we also need to be good stewards and consider the long-term impacts on our environment.
Great points. Regarding the data side, it's interesting because especially when we talk about more geographically dispersed types of variable renewable energy, where it spans large areas of space, it's very important to think about how do you actually capture that data remotely, have a kind of essentially a mesh network environment that can capture that information, and then as there are seismic events, and sends that into some sort of a gateway to the cloud for further analysis. So prevention is important, monitoring is important, and then you talk about predictive analytics, which is super important around not just the demand side, but also the supply side, whether you can actually support that. And the other thing we didn't really talk too much about is scenario planning, in the sense of we've seen some pretty severe rise in extreme weather, hurricanes, tornadoes, rise in floods, and so forth. All of these have an impact in terms of not only military and defense and security, but also the availability of the generation, the transmission of energy as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's only putting more pressure on our entire society. And so, actually one specific example of that is our research team is looking at how to use solar energy for desalination, because you talk about water scarcity as one of the consequences in drought, and the energy required to desalinate water is very high. So we're developing a tool for solar powered desalination, and where the optimal areas in the world would be for it to make sense, as well as the technologies. So again, we need to work in this sort of optimal area where we're kind of killing two birds with one stone, and thinking really smartly about our solutions. I like to talk about how Jeff Sachs mentions our next era, which is sustainable development. No longer can we just consider economic growth. We have to think about economic growth in a responsible manner, and the impacts as well.
I think that's a great note to end. And as we think about sustainability, that economic prosperity does not have to be mutually exclusive to sustainability and SDGs. So today I've been joined by Michael Ginsberg. He is a Doctor of Engineering Science candidate at Columbia University, who's specializing in some very interesting variable renewable energy and integration into the grid. So thank you for joining, Michael.